The first black Russian has been elected to public office. His voters hope to inspire national reforms and put an end to prejudice in Russia. With the highest rate of racially motivated crime in the world, can Russians overcome racial discrimination? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Nick Clark. Welcome to the programme. A town in Russia has elected the country's first black official, an African immigrant from Benin. The move has been hailed by reformers as a milestone in a country that's seen a sharp rise in neo-Nazi violence. Al Jazeera's Niv Barker met up with the new town councillor in the town of Novozavidovo in Russia's Tver region.
To his colleagues, Jean Sagbo is a regular member of the local council. But in provincial Russia, the differences are plain to see. Differences locals in the town of Novozavidovo set aside when 2 months ago they elected him to office.
I thought people were joking when they asked me to become a councillor, but I went home and thought about it. I thought this was a chance to give something back to the country that gave me so much.
For these children, Jean Sagbo is the first black face they have ever seen. He's been in the town for 20 years, working in property development, a respected member of the community, but acceptance didn't come easily.
When I arrived here, it was awful. People used to point at me and shout insults. It was very difficult at that time.
Originally from Benin in West Africa, Sagbo moved to Russia as an economics student in 1982, then a young communist idealist. But the Soviet ideals of racial equality fell short when he fell in love with fellow student Svetlana, now his wife of 27 years.
Back then you couldn't be friends with foreigners. My wife was kicked out of the Communist Youth Party that everyone had to be a member of. She wasn't allowed to take her exams and she was denied further education.
Both adults and children were really offensive to us, but that was then. The things you can say to a 20-year-old girl, you can't say to a middle-aged woman.
When Sagbo's wife broke the news that she was pregnant, her mother cried for months. Years on, and they now have 2 children.
He's a decent man. My aunt lives near him. He sometimes puts flowers on people's doorsteps. You can see he does his best.
You only notice the color of his skin if you don't know him, but on a human level, we relate to him in the same way as everyone else.
Despite changes in attitude, Russia still has the highest rate of racially motivated crime in the world. Hundreds have been killed over the last 5 years, thousands savagely beaten by a growing number of ultranationalists. As a result, Sagbo is reluctant to leave town and avoids public transport. He realizes his new role is a vital test of the country's tolerance of other races. Jean Sagbo may be something of an oddity in this small provincial town, but he's using his position as the country's first and only black elected official to draw national attention to important local issues. He's tackled corruption, pollution and housing problems to win people's trust. His voters here are now hoping the Jean Sagbo story will inspire national reforms and an end to prejudice in other parts of Russia. Niv Barker, Al Jazeera, Novozavidovo in the Tver region.
So there's the man. Let's examine the broader questions now. Joining us in Moscow, Masha Lipman, a political analyst at the Carnegie Moscow Center. In Ottawa, Jeff Zardeo, an assistant professor at the Carleton University's Institute of European and Russian Studies. And in New York, we have Innocenty Grekov, Program Associate for Hate Crimes at Human Rights First. Welcome to you all. I'd like to start with in New York, first of all, with Innocenty Grekov. This whole issue this election has garnered quite a lot of attention. What does it say about Russia today, do you think, that only now in the year 2010 is a black Russian elected to political office, a minor office at that?
I don't think it's a milestone or a breakthrough. It's more of a positive highlight in an otherwise very grim background of neo-Nazi gang violence that continues to victimize minorities in Russia, as your report put it.
When you say a grim background, how grim, how serious is this issue?
Well, the rates of violence and murders especially are unprecedented, and they cannot be compared to European or Eastern European levels at all. already this year there have been 22 murders according to the Sova Center for Information Analysis, our main partner in Moscow. Last year there were 80 murders, which is a decrease from the year 2008, but only a slight decrease, and it still eclipses the levels of 2006. So that's the situation.
Okay, well, so Jeff Sadayo in Ottawa, what's your view on this? Do you think it is a milestone, or would you agree with our previous guest?
I would agree with our previous guest in that I think it does show a certain acceptance by Russians that there could be the possibility of political change through outsiders. But in a sense, it doesn't really mark a shift in the racist violence that has come, which is mainly directed at people of descent from Central Asia and the Caucasus, former Soviet republics, not really at black Africans.
So it could end up being a kind of litmus test, couldn't it, to see how tolerant Russia is becoming?
You have very different senses of foreigners in Russia right now, and it's really people from the Central Asia and the Caucasus, the former Soviet republics, who are causing the prejudice and harassment. There are millions of them coming into Moscow and working, and Russians have resorted to, as our previous speaker said, violence. There's a rise in neo-Nazi and skinhead activity really in the 2000s since then. So in a sense, this might show that there is some more acceptance of say, outsiders and black Africans among many Russians who do feel that the racism has gone too far. But I don't think it changes on the ground the day-to-day situation for most people who are clearly non-whites in Russia.
Mr. Grekov, you wanted to come in there.
Oh, I think the election is a triumph of individualism because the gentleman lived there for 20 years. He was able to gain the trust of the local community. And finally, he was elected to office. There's nothing remarkable about that. If you look at the society in large, you don't see that level of trust. There is mistrust, there are misconceptions and stereotypes guiding the public opinion. And that results in people being demotivated to promote tolerance in Russia.
Okay, well, let's
stand up against the violence.
Let's get the view from Moscow now. We can speak to Masha Lipman, who joins us from there. What's your view? How does this fit into society at large, this election?
Well, I think this election is not a milestone. It's not indicative of anything except this one very curious case. In fact, we don't even have such a category of black Russians or African Russians. This is a tiny community. Most of these people, who are very few in Russia, are foreign students. In this particular case mentioned, this is a foreign student from Africa who actually married a Russian woman and stayed. But it would be wrong, it would be misleading to think that he is a representative of a black community, that he promotes their interests and their rights and their cause by being elected in this small municipality. I think this is just a curious episode. I fully agree with both gentlemen in the show now that the problem is not black or African Russians. The problem is migrant workers. This is a problem in many European countries, but maybe more so in Russia because up until 20 years ago, Russia, the Soviet Union, was a police state with closed borders, and all movements, even within the country, let alone from the outside and outside of Russia, were strictly limited. So it's very new compared to European countries to have so many migrant workers, so many different looking faces in the big cities of Russia. The problem is especially that of big urban centers. The problem indeed is very acute, but I think there is, it was mentioned already that the number of ethnic racial crimes has diminished a little bit. There is a very slight positive trend, and the government is paying more attention to these problems now, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, than it used to.
Okay, Inokunti, Grekov, could you give us an idea of just how difficult it is being black, or from a minority ethnic group at least, in Russia? What kind of problems there are? I mean, John Sagbo there was talking about the fact that when he goes to Moscow, he doesn't dare go on public transport, on the metro or on a bus.
Right, your daily life is affected in a big way. The Moscow Protestant Chaplaincy carried out a survey last year of about 200 Africans in Moscow, and 90% of them reported experiencing some sort of racism daily. More than half of them affected their daily commutes. They wouldn't go on the public transport at night. They would prefer to stay with large groups of people when they were out and about in Moscow. So these are little things that affect minorities in a big way, because they have to adjust.
Okay, so Jeff, what's the driving force behind this racism in Russia? The far right, we've seen a lot of skinhead white supremacists. We saw some examples of that in the film.
Well, certainly the far right is an actor in this, and far right groups have been very virulent in their racism. And it's only been recently, and I think one of the reasons for the decline in the last couple of years has been that the Russian government, for the first time, has really decided to try and crack down on the far right, which they see as a threat to their own governance. Whereas a few years ago, in a sense, the far right was a tool that was propagating this violence against minorities and deflecting attention away from the problems of the state, that the state was not really providing for Russian population. Because I think, again, a lot of this goes back to similarities in situations with Europe, when you have, in cities especially, large numbers of people who are younger people who are unemployed, large numbers of people who really don't see any sense of opportunity or any hope for the future. And in this case, migrants become an easy scapegoat. It's combined with this wealth that Russia has had in the 2000s, oil wealth primarily, that has resulted in a construction boom, which has brought in hundreds of thousands of migrant workers from Central Asia and the Caucasus, who these Russians see as working, and the press has sort of propagated this narrative of migrant workers not only stealing jobs, but also spreading disease, threatening the health of the Russian nation. So you get this sort of social, economic, and cultural factors all wrapped up that has really led to this virulent racism. And then you add to that some of the terror attacks, the 1999 apartment bombings, and we had a bombing in the metro just last year that continues to feed this narrative of danger that the Russian population feels.
And this movement to the far right, white supremacists, there's some irony in that, given that, Masha Lippman, given that millions and millions of Russians gave their lives in the fight against fascism during World War II.
Well, it's not that these groups are popular among the Russian people. Actually, the Russian people may take xenophobic attitudes, which are fairly common in the Russian society, and an idea such as Russia is for Russians is something that in the polls people say they do not mind within reasonable limits. It is the answer that 36% of Russians gave in late 2009. Russia is for Russians. We do not mind if it is implemented within reasonable limits. However, when it comes to racial violence, when it comes to groups that identify themselves as neo-Nazi, neo-fascist, that look very different, very militant, very aggressive. People do not sympathize with violence at all. I think people readily admit and readily share their xenophobic attitudes, not just because they feel it, but also because political correctness is not as common in Russia as it is elsewhere. One more factor that I think is behind these xenophobic attitudes is not just the terrorist attacks originating in the North Caucasus, where people indeed look different, but also it should be remembered that in the past 2 decades, Russia fought 2 wars in Chechnya, 2 very atrocious, bloody wars, and especially the first one when conscripts were fighting in that war, then coming back. It was a terrible, brutalizing experience with young men going there, fighting this horrible war, then coming back, of course, hating the enemy who they saw mutilating, killing, abducting, torturing their fellow soldiers. This is not a minor factor. The second Chechen war did not use as many conscripts as the first one, but still it was a brutalizing experience.
Okay.
And still, North Caucasus is a territory where lots of police serve.
All right, I just want to get back to this point of Sagbo and being the first black elected official. For interest's sake, more than anything, let's compare Russia with a couple of other countries. For example, Britain did have its first non-Caucasian elected member of parliament more than a century ago. That was back in 1892, but really it wasn't until the 1980s that things really started opening up in the UK, and in much of the rest of Europe it's more recent still. France elected its first black mayor in 1989. Ireland had its first black mayor as recently as 2007, and Switzerland elected its first black member of parliament in 2007 too. Italy voted for its first black mayor just last year. So, Jeff Sardeo, does it actually bear comparison, or is the immigration history of Russia just too different?
It's difficult in this when you just have one case, isolated case here or there, to really bear any comparison. But certainly overall, when you look at Russia's experience with migration as compared to a lot of the other European nations, as one of the previous speakers pointed out, you do see some similarities in that you have this movement of labor migration in the 1970s and 80s from poorer countries in the south to wealthier countries in the north. At the same time, you have a sense of acceptance of certain levels of migrants and particular individual cases. When you have migrants such as the mayor in this town in Russia, who have been in the country for several decades, who have learned the language, who have become a well-known community figure, and can then ascend to the position of mayor. So this is a product of a longer-term migration that really began in the 1970s and 80s all throughout Europe. But it doesn't really change the fact on the ground for the most migrants who have come more recently and who are less assimilated into Russian society or European societies for that matter.
And the thing is, Mr. Grekov, Russia really needs immigrant workers, doesn't it?
It does, well, because there is a demand for it, certainly. Except the Russians, the majority of people don't believe so, of course.
So are the authorities doing enough to enable them to assimilate better, would you say, Mr. Grekov?
I don't think so. The authorities aren't doing enough to assimilate, and they aren't doing enough to protect people from this violence. Because it's only in the recent 2 years that the government started to really going after these neo-Nazi gangs and putting prison in jail. And that's what counts.
Okay.
That is what counts.
So, Masha Lippman, what's the solution? It's a question of education, it's a question of time, it's a question of, how do you teach people tolerance?
Well, this is an extremely difficult challenge, of course, and no government can do it alone. Actually, it takes a powerful effort from the public itself. As we know from, let's say, the history of the United States, it took a huge societal effort, anti-racist groups, not necessarily made of African Americans alone. It took white people's effort to fight against racism and against prejudice. Problem is that in the Russian society, no public initiative, anti-racist initiative included, is powerful enough, and the government in general is suspicious of autonomous public initiatives. So the government is doing something, but the government effort will be futile without support from the public, and actually public forces should be the drive for that.
So in a sense, Jeff Sardeo, do you think it'll be a kind of slow accumulation of tolerance over time, and that's what's required?
I think that's an optimistic view, that there would be a slow accumulation of tolerance over time. But there are still several factors that are acting against any kind of growing tolerance. I think, going back to this question of what the government can do or hasn't done, certainly a lot of the racism that these migrants face is from the police themselves. And the police have several strategies to rob migrants, to send migrants back, and most migrants are probably as afraid, if not more afraid, of the police than they are of average Russian citizens. So certainly the government needs to deal with the larger issues that enable police corruption and enable police violence against migrants. But beyond that, yes, I'd agree with the previous speakers that
but
there
there's
has
probably
to be some
racism within the police force itself, isn't there?
Exactly.
There's racism, of course, but it's not just a racist issue here, but it's also an economic issue. And migrant workers are just one end of the scale that are suffering from this, that Russian police know when migrants are carrying the most money, particularly traders at the end of a trading day, and will pick that time to rob them, pick that time to steal their documents, to threaten them. So there's economic and racial issues tied up in there, and larger issues of corruption in Russian society, which also have to be dealt with before this problem can be addressed at a governmental level.
But do you think there's enough will there, Innocenty, for these changes, these required changes to happen? Is there enough willingness from those in authority to make it happen?
We don't see enough. We have a 10-point plan for combating hate violence, so racist and other bias-motivated violence. And it starts with the political will. We need governments to speak out and condemn individual incidents. That's not happening. We need governments to train police and prosecutors to make sure that perpetrators are caught and held accountable. That's not happening. Or they are caught and then they're charged with hooliganism, which is not acceptable. So the Russians need to do more.
Okay, Jeff, just tell me about anti-immigration paramilitary groups. I'm right in saying they exist. Who are they funded by?
Well, often they are linked to figures in the government. They can be funded by business people as well. There's sometimes links as well between these paramilitary groups and business people who bring migrants to Russia, then don't want to pay them, and then can often pay these paramilitary groups to kick them out, or to in effect beat them up and force them to go home. That way that solves the problem of non-payment of wages. But these paramilitary groups often aren't groups that demand a lot of money. They work through the internet, they post their videos up there, they work through sort of networks in these large suburbs of the cities where young people really don't have a lot to do. So it's not necessarily a question of funding, but it's a question, again, of societal attacks on these groups. And there have been a rise in anti-fascist groups in Russia, I will say, in the last couple of years, which has been a positive sign. When you add to that, perhaps, that the government is no longer using neo-Nazi groups in the same way as not necessarily allies, but leaving them alone, that they're seeing them as a threat. This is positive, but it's not really a question of funding, but it's a question of will to attack them, both at a societal and a political level.
We're running out of time, and I just want to bring in Masha Lippman finally. Masha, if we were to have this conversation in 5 years' time, are we going to see many changes for the better, more people like Jean Sagbo holding political office, do you think?
Well, I don't think so. Again, I think that episode cited is really unique and curious, and I don't think a 5 years time is a time span in which we can see major difference in Russia in any aspect, this aspect in particular, because it takes societal changes to begin with, and 5 years is not enough for there to be more tolerance in the Russian society.
So what sort of time frame do you think we're talking about, Masha?
Well, it's really hard to forecast, but I think we're talking about a long time. Tolerance was not a virtue in the Soviet days, certainly not in a regime that was about self-extermination of the nation for several decades. Stalin's terror, think about that. That's not something that doesn't have any bearing on today's violence. It is that in the police state, the forces of violence were kept in check more. And now that they're unleashed, we see what we see. Intolerance plus the factor of migrant workers that are new to many people. And I don't think, I think growing tolerance is something that's a matter of decades.
Okay, it's going to take time, and we're out of time right now. Inokenti Grekov, Masha Lippman, Jeff Zahadeo, we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us here on Inside Story. And thank you for watching this edition. Always keen to hear from you. Drop us a line, insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Nick Clark, it's goodbye.